let me start off by saying I, of course, have seen your work, and I've been very impressed by it. And thank you very much for sitting down and chatting with me.
Thank you. You're very welcome, and my pleasure. Thanks, Marc.
But the thing I didn't quite understand was just the depth and the breadth of your talent. You do music, you paint. I just found out tonight you do yoga.
Yeah.
But is there something that you don't do? I find it very interesting that your artistic enterprises, if you will, are so diverse. Have you always been that way since a child, or is that something that you've learned to cultivate as you got older?
Well, it did kind of appear for me, like the drawing has been there all along. I mean, right from very early in my school years, and music, I guess that would have been when I was 12, 13 or so. We got a guitar for Christmas, and my two brothers and I were kind of arguing over that, or, trying to just get time on it, all of us. And yeah, we all ended up being musical, as well as my half-brother, Carl, tremendously talented as well. And then, because it was kind of a family thing, and we also were attending church and going to choirs and things of this kind, it really did grow musically. We had rock bands that we were doing and playing around with, and we're sort of still doing that these days. Yeah, and then composing original songs was something that developed in a few years. I could never remember how to do any one song all the way through. I just knew bits and pieces of parts of them, and finally decided, I've got to just take this further and learn how to, play songs for people in gatherings and things like that, and then just discovered that I did have a knack for composing. I used to make up tunes to myself when I was a kid, just kind of spontaneously, so I guess there was a bit of it there.
I can see how Tolkien specifically, but also I guess Martin to a lesser extent, would appeal to you. It's the literature, of course, and it's a great deal of visuals, but it's also just the huge presence of music and everything.
Right, yeah, and to a certain degree, the music sort of was separate or kept in a different department in a way. Like I used to think that I could express more personal things through music, write a song without any reference to fairy or Tolkien particularly. A lot of them have been, or just philosophical thoughts, even political thoughts at times. Whereas with Tolkien, it was more kind of a passion for expressing the ideas in Tolkien, fairy, the sort of that kind of longing you have for another time and place, just enchantment and other things of this kind, the fantastic and the sublime, the mystical, the hidden thing, all those sort of delicious things that are in Tolkien. I found ways of expressing those in the art, and I was always intrigued by the idea of using realism to convey fairy ideas, just make them visual, treat it almost like theatrically, try to kind of bridge the world of fairy and the world of reality, or kind of present a window, sort of a photographic window into this fairy world or realm. So those are the kind of things that were playing around in my mind. Illustrating Tolkien was a bit of a game for me. What if the author of the books, who, as we know, died in 1973, what if he had actually commissioned me to illustrate his world? What would he have wanted? So I, ask myself questions like that, or try to tease out what I thought he really would express or expect to see, or what these books justified in terms of illustration style. Maybe considering that they were published and written in an earlier era and that sort of thing.
It's interesting. When I sat down to compile my questions for you, the very first one that popped up, I think it's really appropriate now, again, realizing that the depth of your different artistic pursuits. But what do you think our obsessions or our passions say about us as individuals?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question, a sort of psychology question. But I think they do say a lot about us. They say a lot about our fears and our anxieties, I would say, as well, and what we need in terms of countering the pressure we may feel in a difficult and confusing world. So, hopefully it doesn't become a morbid obsession, but just kind of a healthy habit, an escape in the sense of Tolkien's definition of escape, that, a prisoner of war has a duty to escape, and a person who's overburdened with the cares of this world, so to speak, takes respite in an alternate world, or a more purified and abstract world like Middle-earth. And so it's a good obsession, but of course it can become overwhelming, like anything, everything in moderation, including moderation.
Good answer. Was there a specific hook that served as a transition into Martin's work?
Well, what happened with George R.R. Martin was that he contacted me, this would be probably 10 years ago or so, and I hadn't read his books. I hadn't really heard much about them, and then he approached me with his publisher at the time, Misha Merlin. They were doing these deluxe editions, and asked if I would be willing to be one of the illustrators of these deluxe editions. John Howe was one of the other illustrators, and Jeffrey Jones did the first book, Game of Thrones. And I asked my friend Martin Springett what he thought of George R.R. Martin, and if he'd heard of him or he knew about him and that sort of thing. And he said, "Oh yeah, George R.R. Martin's quite a big author these days. He's up and coming, and if he's calling you, that's actually quite a compliment." So that kind of put me on notice, and I thought, well, I better, read these books. And as soon as I started reading Game of Thrones, I was quite hooked on it. I don't normally embrace other authors beyond Tolkien. A handful here and there, and some of them are science fiction, but I didn't go out of my way to sort of read other fantasy, and sometimes I've been disappointed, for instance. And it just, it's hard to match Tolkien, obviously. It's extraordinary. But George R.R. Martin proved that he was an amazing storyteller. His characters were interesting. The way he structured the novel was engaging and drew you in. And I found that it wasn't hard at all to read a 750-page novel and then continue on to the next and the next one. I became a fan quite readily on his books. And as it happened, I didn't end up doing the illustrating of one of the novels at that time because of circumstances. He had me lined up for, say, the fifth book, which was originally supposed to be the last book, and then it took longer and longer for that to be published. And in the meantime, I was approached about illustrating the castles for his up-and-coming book on kind of his general guide to the world of Ice and Fire, which still hasn't been published, but I did those castle paintings in 2007, and he worked with me on those. It was really an amazing experience, and I discovered that my background in architectural rendering was very handy. And I also discovered that Tolkien doesn't have very many castles, proper castles as the medieval world would have understood them. In Middle-earth, Minas Tirith, the city, is more of a citadel, a fortress, but it doesn't really have the same structure as a castle. So I did a lot of research suddenly on castles and the way they're built and the components of them, and then started designing my own according to each of the royal houses in the Ice and Fire world. So that's kind of how it happened with George R.R. Martin, and now I'm a big fan of them and have my copy of Dance with Dragons all ready to read, except I'm kind of waiting till I get through this illustration job on the Game of Thrones.
So you haven't read Dance with Dragons yet?
I haven't read it yet. No, I'm kind of saving it, which is ironic considering it took, 5 years or so to finally turn up. Yeah, but there we are. And I haven't seen the HBO live TV series either of Game of Thrones, which is actually good because it doesn't give me ideas or kind of compromise my imagination when it comes to this book.
That's interesting. What about the comic book? Have you been reading that at all?
The which what?
They just started doing a comic adaptation of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen that either, really. I'm sort of, only a limited amount of sort of depth for me with George R. R. Martin.
It's interesting how his story just recently is starting to become this like multimedia empire almost.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is exciting to see that. I mean, it's an amazing time to be given this commission for Game of Thrones, and if it sounds odd that I would be doing that book, it's because the original publishers, Misha Merlin, who were doing those deluxe editions, they lost the contract about 3 books in or something. And for a long time, Subterranean Press apparently debated whether to go back and do those books again that were already issued as collectibles or not. And they decided ultimately they did want to do that. And that's when I was approached about that this past year. And of course, it was like, wow, yeah, absolutely, I'd love to take the book on.
You know, it's interesting. I've read Lord of the Rings many, many times, of course, but I never realized the lack of castles, or really the lack of structures in general, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Very interesting how Tolkien seems to be very nature-based.
Right.
Whereas Martin, almost, I guess you could argue, says that nature is very, for lack of a better term, negative. The second that the king dies, everyone starts to pillage and rape and rob, and wolves prowl the wilderness, and of course, just slaughter everyone and everything around them.
Right.
Do you find one vision more appealing than the other, at least in terms of visualizing it in your paintings?
Well, I guess, having been involved in Tolkien for so long, and it's actually getting to be about 4 decades now since I read The Lord of the Rings as a teenager and started illustrating scenes from it and drawing scenes from it, right away. So it's really in my kind of DNA, as it were, or under my skin in a long, kind of a very sort of advanced way, I guess you'd say. So I would always consider it the baseline, or my kind of, I suppose, archetype of a fantasy world, so familiar to me now. But George R. R. Martin's world, it's very vivid to me as well, and I know what you mean about it's a very different sort of orientation. It's much more kind of historical seeming, or realistic and edgy, and there's a lot more of the profane, things like that Tolkien is more of a high-minded writer who kind of shies away from. That's just writes in this sort of heroic style, of the novelist style of the 19th century, as opposed to someone like George R. R. Martin. It would be crazy for him to write in that style. It would be immediately sort of identified as kind of imitative of Tolkien.
Be interesting, though.
It would. But there's some interesting flourishes in George R. R. Martin. He's because you don't expect it as much. So when he does wax poetic, or there's something more sublime happening that truly is inspired and comes from a certain depth, it really is resonant.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And actually, I was going to ask you about how A Song of Ice and Fire is definitely more based off of the medieval period and based off of history in general, as opposed to mythology. Mm-hmm. Do you find that influencing even just a little bit the way that you render the castles?
Yep. It allows me to be more realistic, draw ideas from the real world more easily. With Tolkien, I would deliberately try to alter historical precedents and models for things so that it still seemed like Middle-earth was kind of an other world, a different place, and kind of self-contained. Just as with his writing, it's familiar but not familiar at the same time in some ways. And George R. R. Martin's descriptions and characters and things like that feel like they could exist, except that he also injects a lot of sort of horror and kind of what am I looking for? The word sort of the fantastical, does get into it, and there are times when you're like, would somebody really be able to come back from the dead? But well, yes, they do. We have the others and these whites and things of this kind that sort of suddenly intrude into what is otherwise a very believable situation.
Yeah, that the first time I read Song of Ice and Fire, I was living in Japan, with my wife, who are English teachers. And, her a little bit less, but me more so. I had a lot of time spent during my day on the train going to work. Spent about an hour and a half on the train every day.
Wow.
We just thirsted for anything in English. Like even people that we would meet who were also from America or Australia or where have you, Canada, of course.
Yeah.
People who wouldn't normally read, they just grab anything and everything around them. And a buddy of mine had a Song of Ice and Game of Thrones,
right.
And I'm like, oh, what's this? This looks like Tolkien ripoffs. Crap. All right, let's see what it is. And I had a chip on my shoulder that whole book.
Oh yeah.
And finally, by the end of it, I'm like, all right, God damn it, I have to read the second one. I have to see how that story continues. And then I realized, of course, I was hooked and I loved it, and it was a brilliant piece of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, when you read that first book, it really kind of, the way it slowly devolves, if you will, into the more standard fantasy tropes. He really sneaks up on you with them.
Yeah, exactly. And I kind of like that part of it. He holds back, and in that way he is similar to Tolkien, who doesn't go out of his way to have flashy magic or other kinds of extraordinary phenomena. It just comes into it here and there when it's needed, and that makes it that much more powerful and exciting, I suppose. And, you know, it's interesting with George R. R. Martin that he does borrow just a little bit here and there from Tolkien. A name like Drogo, that's Frodo's father in The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, and there, you know, it's a character in one of the Dothraki, you know, the lord that Daenerys marries.
Do you, well, let me rephrase this. You said the other night when I was talking to you, you were working on the sketches for the characters themselves.
You're right.
Is that something that you also find yourself relying more upon, say, history books than the text, the book of Song of Ice and Fire?
I might go and try to find a face or an actor or something that reminds me or looks similar to the person or the character. But I've been actually just drawing them out of my head a lot of the time, just trying to, you know, follow my impression of the person and see what I get and whether I think it matches my imagination. And I'm reasonably good at that. What I sent to them just this week, a set of sketches, was mostly based on just experimenting with imaginary characters that felt right, and, you know, with fairly minimal reference to photographs or other kinds of models of these people. And, you know, one or two cases I was told that the characters should look younger or not quite as you know, villainous, say, and did, you know, revise them accordingly. And but I was actually glad that by and large they seem to have hit the mark or not been. They didn't suck too bad, you know. So that's encouraging, because it is. I'm a bit nervous about doing characters, and I'm a bit better with landscape and creatures and architecture and shiny things. But I enjoy doing characters and caricatures and things like that. So I just try to, you know, let it go and see what happens. And it is exciting when you sort of see it come out and you think, hey, not bad.
Do you find yourself getting in these long, drawn-out conversations with Martin about the history of the cultures or the personal backstory of the characters?
Well, to be frank, I'm a little reluctant to ask him about stuff like that, because my impression is he's so busy and he's got so much kind of going on that I try to just, you know, deal with the business at hand. And I don't sort of want to ask too many questions or probe him, although it is tempting at times. And if he volunteers things, I think, oh, well, that's great, you know. And I sort of appreciate it, but I just don't want to be kind of too much of a fan and or, you know, ask him things that he isn't willing to sort of put down in this blog anyway or something. I suppose, you know, I'll probably get a few nuggets here and there, but I am kind of respectful of his privacy or his willingness to just, you know, deal with me on the matter at hand. And I guess I got that partly from working with Christopher Tolkien back when I was doing the Silmarillion. And it was really wonderful having a working relationship with him and just discussing pictures and what the content would be and what was, you know, reasonable. And sometimes, you know, things would come into it of a personal nature. He would share something with me. But I was always aware that, you know, he was in control of it, and it would not be good to stray too far or, you know, presume too much familiarity. because it is a working relationship, and he sees it as having sort of limits to it, and not to sort of take advantage of that or anything. So and I like that when people treat me that way too. They don't presume too much without sort of asking first or something like that. If it's okay with me to go into something.
I wonder, how odd is it to you that you're working on this story that, obviously with Lord of the Rings, it came out in the 50s, it had been done for quite some time, but with Song of Ice and Fire, it probably will take another 50 years for the last two books to come out.
Right.
Does that color your thinking or your approach to the work, or are you just concentrating on that first book?
Mostly just concentrating on how to visualize the book, and kind of aware that once I finish the job, when I finish the illustrations, that's got to stand. That's I can't take it back and revise them. And I haven't. Besides the Silmarillion, I haven't really illustrated that many books, and it is, a peculiar sort of project to take on. It's a bit of a high wire act. You've got to be consistent, your style and kind of quality of your work and continuity and things of this kind. So it's a wonderful thing to be doing, but I have a healthy respect for just being careful. That I just keep my standards as high as possible, and one of the things about doing a Game of Thrones is the obvious thing that here I'm dealing with a living author. I can ask him questions about his own creation, whereas with Tolkien, except for that one letter I managed to send him in 1972, where I'd only done one painting by that time, but I did send some photos of it and got a little bit of feedback from him. That was it. I had to just assume I had some knack for interpreting his world, and when I got feedback from fans continually saying that I seemed to know what was in their heads, or I really sort of seemed to nail it, whatever the picture was, the character, that was what really encouraged me that I had a gift for this particular thing. And I was always a little bit nervous about doing other fantasy worlds, partly because I felt like I'd really hit home with Tolkien, but I didn't want to sort of be in a kind of a ghetto where that was the only guy I was any good at. So it is great. It's very exciting and very kind of important to me that I'm transitioning into George R.R. Martin with all the differences that means.
It is very much an appealing work. It's also a very disturbing one and disquieting one. I always kind of compare it to The Sopranos, where I love that show, but it's obviously difficult to watch at times.
Comparison, yeah.
Speaking of film and television, there's one last question I have to ask you.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to put you in the spot, so if I am putting you in the spot, please just tell me to go piss off, and I kindly will.
Okay.
The Lord of the Rings movies.
Oh, right.
Did you care for those?
No, I don't mind answering that question. I guess the short answer is I have mixed feelings, but by and large I enjoyed them, and I was quite impressed with the extraordinary amount of work that went into them. And I'm aware that kind of work goes into a lot of movies these days, and I am kind of blown away by the amount of work and art direction and everything that we see nowadays. It's almost routine. But yeah, given all the variables, given all the possibilities and chance of making a royal mess of it, one thinks of Dune, for instance, with the David Lynch version, which of course he was constrained by the studios and didn't really quite get to do it the way he might have wanted to, but it was a bit of a disaster. And it's just so easy to fumble something as huge as Lord of the Rings, and with so many fans kind of putting so much pressure on the production as well. I think that one of the reasons the Fellowship is, for me and a lot of people, the most enjoyable of the three movies was because I think Jackson was extra careful to want to do it the way the book describes things and to capture the magic and just be more kind of attentive to Tolkien. Whereas in the second and third, I think he took liberties and took ideas with storyline in different directions.
Yeah.
And I generally, like, I've read the arguments, I've heard the discussions and the pros and cons in a lot of ways over those changes that he made. And I've come to respect the thinking that went into that in some cases, although in some cases I still say an attentive reader would spot the problem easily, and it kind of takes away from that suspension of disbelief. Yeah, there were just certain things that, especially even in these extended editions, that was just kind of self-indulgent, and so mixed feelings about it. But overall, like, very impressed, and I was delighted with most of the casting and just the sort of certain moments here and there where you can see he's really he loves these books clearly, and considering all the amount of pressure and millions of dollars and all the rest of it, it could so easily have strayed away further than it did. I think we'll see with The Hobbit a kind of a Hobbit on steroids version too, just kind of more edgy, more close to being the Lord of the Rings, the way Tolkien may have even wanted to do himself once the Lord of the Rings became such a more important book. But he could never really quite reconcile the two books, and those inconsistencies are always going to be there, unfortunately.
Yeah, I never knew that Tolkien was rewriting The Hobbit in the style or the voice of Lord of the Rings until just a couple months ago, actually. That really surprised me. I'm very interested in reading that and seeing how different it was. It is
really interesting, the history of the writing of the Lord of the Rings, because for the first few chapters, he was thinking he was writing a sequel to the Lord of the Rings, to The Hobbit, and it's styled in the same way. It's kind of whimsical, kind of asides and a bit of humor and kind of mischief and things of this kind, very Hobbit-y. And then it just seems to transition into this bigger, more solemn and dark story, of course, and certain key changes where it was Gandalf coming down the path in the Green Hill country in the nighttime in the original drafts, and then he realized if it was a Black Rider in pursuit of Frodo, it would have a far more kind of menacing feel to it, and realize what he had right there, and it's interesting also to note, not to kind of divert off into the side here, but the chapter, the House of Tom Bombadil, I believe it's almost verbatim first draft, and that's I think that's one of the reasons why Jackson kind of skirted around that part of the book, because it's really part of The Hobbit, and to Tolkien's credit, he left it the way it was. And then just sort of built a story around it, and I think I love that fact, and it added more depth when I knew that. He was plotting. There was no Middle Earth when he first started writing the books, The Lord of the Rings. He just kind of made the map expand ahead of him, as he decided where he was going and what the terrain needed to be and things like that. There's a lot to know about all of it that seems like, why isn't it obvious to him what's going on, and why couldn't he kind of reconcile The Hobbit? He did go back and revise some of it. The riddle game was changed a little bit, and it is interesting, apparently, according to my friend, to read the first draft of Hobbit and then the later revised edition and see the comparisons.
I just I got, as a Christmas present for myself, Chris Tolkien's book, The Return of the Shadow, I believe it's called.
Right.
The making of Fellowship, and I just got stopped at the point where actually it was Gandalf coming down the road instead of the Black Rider. So
you know about that, yeah?
Just recently, just in the last couple of weeks, I had no idea. And I love, as a writer myself, I love the malleability of narrative and how it's constantly shifting and changing, especially after even you finished writing it, you still go back somehow. I really hope that we get to see something like that, just as detailed and just as thorough as with Martin's work. I would love to see how the first draft of Game of Thrones was different from what's going on now.
Yeah, actually, there is so much more to know about those books if you really were to get into the same depth of analysis. And with Tolkien, we've got an advanced amount of scholarly writing on him. It's third generation now. So there's a wealth of information about how he constructed it and what he was kind of thinking and the difficulties that he ran into and all of it, and just the whole huge thing of trying to reconcile the entire legendarium, the Silmarillion books and everything. But George R. R. Martin, it's, considering the scope and hugeness of his book as well. I mean, you're in awe of the amount of plotting that's involved, and no wonder it took him so long to finish the next book, because as it gets bigger and bigger, the stakes sort of get higher. Like, he's got to maintain the quality and the interest and take the storyline in the direction he needs it to go, and whether or not he's worked all those things out, he probably hasn't. So it becomes, an enormous amount of pressure, probably.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Well, on that note, a last request, if I may. I would love to see maybe the back of this book or the back of the last book that you do, whenever that may be. I want to see Tom Bombadil, his yellow pants blurry or blue jacket or whatever that is, next to Ned Stark.
Oh, okay.
I want them arm in arm, going down the primrose path. That's a fantastic image, isn't it?
Right. We'll have to see about that. Now I guess there'll be separate realms, but yeah. Well, I hope I'll be doing a lot of more George R. R. Martin in the years to come, and certainly I've got lots of Tolkien left to come out of me.
The castles themselves, the paintings that I've seen, are absolutely just... They're beautiful, of course, but they're also very engrossing. You very much can fall right into that page. So I'm very interested in seeing the finished work, and I wish the best of luck to you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mark. Appreciate it very much.